We will now begin our first plenary session of the conference. We will hear two keynote speeches from our respected keynote speakers. The first keynote speech is on dimensions of equity and inclusion in education in a time of disruption. Professor Tim Loreman, Ph.D., President and Vice-Chancellor, Concordia University of Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, is our first keynote speaker for today. Dr. Tim Loreman is the 8th President and Vice-Chancellor of the Concordia University of Edmonton. Installed on January 1, 2017, Dr. Loreman's transformational leadership style and bold vision for the future have propelled CUE forward toward realizing its potential as Canada's preeminent small university. Dr. Tim Loreman joined CUE in 2003 as a professor in the Faculty of Education. He is known around the world for his work in inclusive education and pedagogy and holds a diploma in teaching from Monash University, a graduate diploma in special education from Deakin University, a Master of Education from Deakin University, and a Doctor of Philosophy in Education Psychology from Monash University. Prior to being installed as CUE's 8th President and Vice-Chancellor, he served as Vice President Academic and Provost. Under his leadership, CUE has grown into a place of spirit and discovery, offering students from around the world a boutique learning experience that prioritizes wellness, curiosity, and active citizenship. The plenary session will be chaired The plenary session will be chaired by Professor Dr. Syed Mohammad Ghulam Farooq, former Director General, Directorate of Secretary and Higher Education, Ministry of Education, Bangladesh. May I request Professor Farooq to come on stage and start the plenary session. Thank you. May I request Professor Farooq to escort Professor Munzrul Sir to the stage. Thank you. Professor Tim Loreman, can you hear us? May I request you to unmute yourself? Professor Tim Loreman, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Perfect.
Yep.
Thank you. Let's welcome Professor Tim Loreman to start his first keynote speech. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And it's lovely to be here. And I want to thank you very much for inviting me. It was a few years ago now since I've been in Dhaka. I visited, I think it was in 2016, and had a wonderful time. And that was the second of these conferences, I believe. So now we've come quite a long way, but unfortunately, due to COVID times, we're having to do this in the virtual format. So I'll try to make this as interesting as I can. I want to thank Professor Tarika-san for inviting me to do this presentation, and also want to say thank you to Professor Wahiduzzaman for his confidence in the invitation as well to be here this evening, and many others. I have been in touch and working with many colleagues from Bangladesh over the years, and most importantly, a recent research project that I'm a very small part of, about inclusive education in Bangladesh and other countries in Asia. So I'm very pleased to be a part of that, and very grateful. And it's really quite a terrific partnership. But today, so I'll put on my presentation here, or share my screen with you, and I hope you can see that. Please let me know if you can't see that. But today, it's actually, well, when I say today, it's that there's a 12-hour time difference between Canada and Dhaka, or where I am in Canada. So it's 11:30 or 11:40 in the evening here, and nearly noon time for you. So that's why I'm sitting here in the half darkness talking to you. But today I want to talk to you about dimensions of equity and inclusion in a time of disruption. And I'll start by saying that, for the past 3 years, we've really experienced significant disruption. They're probably the most disruptive years to our global society since the Second World War. And I think in some ways, this could be argued, these are even more disruptive times and more profound in terms of some of the potential long-term consequences that we might face. So this presentation is going to explore 3 areas with respect to the recent pandemic global events, and how they relate to inclusive education for children with disabilities. Now, these will include some of the challenges that children with disabilities have experienced in receiving an equitable and inclusive education during the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. I'll talk about the impact on inclusive education of what's been termed an empathy deficit. And we're seeing this as we begin to emerge from the worst impacts of the global pandemic, and also some of the opportunities and challenges for inclusive education that have been brought about by what's being called the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And that this Fourth Industrial Revolution is based in technology, and it has really advanced exponentially throughout the pandemic. Finally, I'm going to talk about something that's very recent and in fact is still happening, and that's questions that about the potential local and the global impact about the extended war in Ukraine, and what that might mean for inclusive education internationally as well as in Ukraine. So when we think of inclusive education, there are 3 justifications to support inclusive practices in schools globally. And these are educational, social, and economic. And this is from UNESCO and was cited by Umesh Sharma, who, my great friend, Professor Umesh Sharma, who you just heard from, I think, in the previous session here. Now, according to Professor Sharma, the educational justification is that all learners, irrespective of any differences, must learn together. And inclusion must benefit all learners. So the social justification really suggests that one of the simplest ways to modify learner attitudes and to create societies where individuals belong is to do this through an inclusive education approach. The economic justification suggests that, in fact, inclusive education is a very cost-effective measure to educate children with diverse learning needs. And I recently wrote or edited a book with a couple of colleagues from Germany where we looked at resourcing inclusive education and the cost effectiveness of it, but also ways in which it can be done so that it's not an undue burden on school systems or individual schools. Context really matters, though, and inclusion isn't a one-size-fits-all model that you can apply to all countries or to all systems. And one of the things that strikes me when I travel overseas, and this was especially vivid when I visited Bangladesh a few years ago, are that our systems are so different that it is really hard for someone in Canada like myself, and I grew up in Australia and my education was all in Australia. So my education and my experience has all been in Western schools. It's very, very difficult for me to think that I should be advising anyone in Bangladesh, for example, or any other country where the context is so different. I mean, in Canada, a class of 30 students is viewed as a very large class of children to teach. Whereas, of course, I don't need to tell you that in Bangladesh, 30 students is an incredibly small class in most cases. Many people in Bangladesh teach classes of 60 students or many more than 60 students. So some of the ideas of inclusive education that apply in Canada, for example, would not apply in Bangladesh. And, even similar if we consider places such as the Pacific Islands, it's even different again. So really what we have to do is think of inclusive education in terms of some principles and try to define it and try to think about it in those ways. So there are three ways that people have tried to define inclusive education. And those ways are, first of all, and I'm guilty, by the way, of trying to define it in all of these ways. I've come to the conclusion that the third version I'm going to give you of a definition of inclusion is the correct one for now, probably until I change my mind and start talking about something else in a couple of years. But one way of defining inclusion is to define it by what inclusion is. And so we might construct a list of things that have to be present for you to call an education experience inclusive. For example, those things might be adequate resources, or they might be a common shared curriculum, or any number of other things. And the challenge with that, though, of course, is that you tend to leave some things out when you describe inclusion in that way. And it's less context sensitive than describing it in other ways. So as I said earlier, what might be seen as inclusive in some countries wouldn't be seen as inclusive or even possible in other countries. A second way that some people have tried to define inclusive education is by trying to define it by what it isn't. So in this way, we say inclusive education isn't classes of children separated from their same age peers. And once again, you construct a whole laundry list of possible definitions, and it suffers from the same problems that the first type of definition suffers from. But I think the best definition of inclusive education is a very simple one, and it's this, and it's one that Tony Booth many years ago was talking about, and people like Roger Slee and many others have talked about, and that is that inclusion can be viewed as removing barriers to full participation in education. So that is a very context-sensitive definition, because what that means is that you analyze your school situation, your educational system, for the sorts of things that are keeping kids out and are keeping kids from participation. And then the job, of course, of the inclusive educator is to try to remove those barriers so that all children can participate. So that's the definition dealt with there. I want to talk a little bit about equity and inclusion during the COVID-19 pandemic. I've written a little bit about this with a colleague of mine, Brent Bradford, and also Umesh Sharma. And this is an article that we have in press, I think, that we've been asked to write, and it's going to be published, we hope, soon. But children with disabilities were amongst some of the hardest hit during the COVID-19 pandemic. And the switch to remote learning in many areas of the world presented challenges for many learners, and especially learners who required additional supports. So this included children with disabilities, yes, but not only children with disabilities. It also encompassed issues of poverty, issues of gender inequity, and other areas of educational disadvantage. For example, even in the wealthy United States, it was estimated that 1 in 7 children lacked home internet access. And this number actually increases in homes of disadvantaged children. And so when probably the wealthiest country in the world, the United States, or one of the wealthiest at least, has this issue, think about what other areas of the world are trying to deal with in terms of access to the adequate technology and adequate internet access. So in the abrupt shift away from face-to-face learning, many of the principles of inclusive education on which so much time and so much effort had been spent were in many cases exposed to be little more than lip service. So the most vulnerable children were left behind, they were ignored, and in some cases they were even had their funding removed. The long-term impact over the 2 years of this situation really remains to be seen. But I'll give you an example from the province that I live in Canada, of Alberta, where our schools went abruptly online when the pandemic started, and it was March of 2020. And there was only a very brief period of notice that this was going to happen. I mean, it was a pandemic. We felt that we had to get our children out of schools and get them learning at home. But this created a number of problems. For example, teachers were not necessarily very skilled at teaching in an online environment because they'd never done it before. And in some ways, online teaching gets trickier the younger the age group. So in Canada, children start school at the age of 5. So imagine the challenges of trying to provide a 5-year-old with an adequate education online. I have a friend who teaches this age of child, and she said it was almost impossible to teach in the way that she likes to teach, and to have these children learn the sorts of things that they need to learn at that age. So schools became more reliant on parents to assist children with learning. And of course, this is fine and this is good. And for many parents with the resources and skills, this is just a terrific way of doing things. However, many parents either had their own work commitments or for other reasons were just not in a position to be able to provide this sort of assistance. Now, this was even more challenging for children with disabilities. So in Alberta here, funding for teacher assistance was almost immediately cut. And this was for reasons I really can't fathom or understand the logic behind. In Bangladesh and other parts of Asia with large class sizes and few additional supports, not having a teacher assistant might not sound like much of a big deal. But consider that in Alberta, education has been structured this way for more than 40 years. So teachers are used to teaching in an environment with teaching assistants to assist children with disabilities. And so navigating this change became extremely challenging for them. So the pandemic really truly exposed the extent to which we speak a lot about inclusion and we say a lot of nice things, but when the situation becomes challenging, the children who are most disadvantaged are still those children who have disabilities. So we developed a number of, or not developed, but Brent Bradford and Umesh Sharma and I have identified in this publication a number of principles for inclusive education. And these include homeschool partnerships, adequate resource provision, positive attitudes in a welcoming environment, teacher professional readiness, the use of inclusive pedagogy, a common flexible curriculum, barrier-free environments, age-appropriate heterogeneous learning environments, and support for social and emotional development. And each of these principles was in some way violated during the pandemic. So we have offered 3 steps that we think schools globally can use and move forward with in response to this. The first one is to create strong home-school partnerships. Of course, this isn't new. People have been saying that this needs to be the case for a very long time. So school communities must continue to explore and discover ways to establish quality, deep-rooted relationships with families to ensure that there's a true understanding of learner needs from both the school and the family perspective. It is of the utmost importance that educators continue to discover ways to ensure effective communication and to understand, and that understanding is focused upon promoting learning for all. The second step forward, we think, is to develop a deeper understanding of the roles of teacher assistants. So during the remote learning stage, it was stated that teacher assistants will now not be working by the government in Alberta, so they were cut. This is really problematic for the reasons I've already discussed. So the critical importance of teacher assistants really needs to be understood at all levels of school and also by our decision makers in government. So laying teachers off in the midst of a pandemic or some kind of emergency is actually the opposite of what needs to happen. So some schools did demonstrate a great deal of knowledge about the importance of teacher assistants, and Australian schools were amongst these. And actually, teacher assistants were really used in very positive ways during the remote learning stage. But that obviously didn't happen everywhere. The third piece here, the third step to move forward, is to build and maintain peer relationships, because this is a vital piece of learning, of course, the developing ways for learners to build and maintain strong relationships. And there's much shared throughout the literature about communication challenges and those sorts of things, but these are, of course, enlarged by situations where children are not together face to face. So children of all ages and in fact even adults found that their social relationships were deeply impacted by having to be online so much and do school by Zoom. So we need to have a look at the importance and continue to value the importance of relationships that our students have. The second issue that I would like to talk about here is what's called the empathy deficit. So compounding the practical disadvantage of resource changes and a move away from face-to-face teaching and learning was the formation of what's been termed an empathy deficit, and I got this from a writer called Bruce. And this empathy deficit grew more acute as the pandemic progressed. So at the start of the pandemic, we probably all noticed people were very sympathetic towards one another, and as we got to the second year, towards the end of the second year, people were a lot less sympathetic. And this has been called the empathy deficit. It was by no means limited to school education, but it certainly made its presence felt in that environment. And although focused on medical professionals, Bukhari, Robinson, Abedajo, Heslop, and Walker in 2021 noted that empathy, and this is a quote, empathy may be influenced by conscious or unconscious biases, such as personal, religious, political, racial, and class. But it can also be limited due to daily stresses resulting in compassion fatigue. However, research has also suggested that the perceived effects of feeling empathy, whether positive or negative, could reduce over time. So a report in the Calgary Herald here in Canada noted that, to quote, the Canadian Medical Association and researchers at the University of British Columbia conducted a series of surveys during the pandemic to monitor Canadians' mental health at various stages. Results of the most recent survey showed that 14% of Albertans are feeling empathetic, compared to 29% surveyed in May of 2020. This is a decline of 15%. So Alberta isn't the only place in the country where this is documented. Overall, 13% of Canadians surveyed said they felt empathetic now, while 23% said they were feeling empathetic at the onset of the pandemic, and that's from Babbage. The development of feelings of empathy can result, as we know, in improved attitudes towards stigmatized groups. And Batson and his colleagues in 1997 pointed that out. And it's increasingly clear that positive attitudes towards children with disabilities and inclusive education are essential components for successful implementation of an inclusive education approach. And I've been lucky enough with my colleagues and friends, Chris Forman and Umesh Sharma, to do some work in this area, and also some of the participants and organizers of this conference, such as Professor Assam, have also been great contributors in this area. So Parsons and Brown in 2001 examined pre-service teachers' reflective writings and dialogue, and they identified several student stances towards the notion of diversity. And when I say student, I'm talking about pre-service teachers. And these include diversity being as about other than me. So some students revealed a sense of egocentrism as they limit their thinking about diversity as being what they are not. So if I am a white middle-aged male, then diversity includes everyone who isn't that. The second, another stance was that diversity is a challenge. So many of their pre-service teachers viewed diversity as a problem, and they wrote about overcoming challenges presented by variations amongst students in a classroom or a school. And this was also a finding that Professor Brent Bradford and I found when we were looking at students and pre-service teachers and physical education, inclusive education. It was very similar, as was this one, that diversity is a condition to be fixed. So some pre-service teachers envisioned themselves as rescuers, and they saw children in poverty or children of various ethnicities or divorce or with disabilities as being inherently needy. So in this respect, disability and diversity is seen as being indicative of brokenness and requiring repair. And diversity as requiring color blindness was another thing where you are supposed to somehow not recognize cultural differences or differences in ability and just be kind of quote unquote colorblind towards them. And finally, a very small minority of students looked at disability as a cause for, not disability, diversity as a cause for celebration. So if we are to be successful in rebooting an inclusive approach to education for children with disabilities following the pandemic, we must first attend to the empathy deficit by deliberately targeting and by promoting more empathetic school and classroom cultures. And there are three ways that Parsons and Brown suggest we can do this. With reference to disability, we must really examine our own closely held beliefs about diversity and inclusion. And this can be in sharp contrast to the typical atmosphere of some education systems in which teachers expect or are expected to fit in with a particular ethos. So we should really look at our own attitudes towards disability and inclusion and how those attitudes impact what we teach, and examine our areas of practice and the areas of curricula that we need to embrace. The second piece is fostering voice. We need to foster the voice not only of students with disabilities, but those from marginalised groups generally. And this includes providing honest and sincere mechanisms for providing input from families and supporters of children in this group. And encouraging risk-taking is the third piece. So encouraging intellectual and emotional risk-taking is really important if we're able to help teachers to develop social and interpersonal empathy. I'm going to move on now to the fourth industrial revolution. The fourth industrial revolution is described as being, to quote, characterized by a fusion of technologies that is blurring the lines between physical, digital, and biological spheres. And that's from Schwab 2016. So while this has its root in the period prior to the onset of COVID-19, it really progressed exponentially over those 2 years to date, particularly in the area of the development of artificial intelligence, or AI. And this has profound implications for the inclusion of children with disabilities. And these implications are largely positive, in my opinion. So judiciously employed, AI has the potential to support children with disabilities while at the same time making effective use of limited resources. As one example, an AI-driven assistant for people with disabilities called Maya has recently been developed at my university, Concordia University of Edmonton, here in Canada. And Maya has a number of different features, including a study buddy, a material summarizing feature, and an assignment management function. And more features are in development. So this is sort of a draft prototype version of Maya that I'm going to show you actually in a minute here. Students using Maya it was developed initially for a tool for university students with disabilities. But actually, as you'll see, it applies to any university student. And I'll go further than that. I'll say it actually applies to any student, period. It's that sort of universal. I think students of almost any age, providing they can read and write, can use this. So it's just one example of how AI can be deployed to assist not only students with disabilities, but all students. But one significant challenge of the fourth industrial revolution, of course, is access. And this goes back to my initial comments. As previously discussed, there are often acute issues with respect to access to technology for disadvantaged children. And this issue really must be addressed if these children are going to be able to adequately participate in the opportunities provided by the fourth industrial revolution. And I have a video here that I'd like to show you of Maya. So I hope there's volume and that you can hear it.
Maya has 3 key features. These features were developed based on survey responses from Concordia University of Edmonton students with disabilities. Our first feature is the study buddy.
Oops, I'm sorry.
Maya has 3 key features. These features were developed based on survey responses from Concordia University of Edmonton students with disabilities. Our first feature is the study buddy. The study buddy is an AI-powered chat application. The study buddy is not intended to provide 100% accurate answers for academic exams or classes. Rather, it serves as an interesting companion from which you can derive inspiration. So let's see how our study buddy works. I'll type in a question such as, what type of mental health problems are there? Maya answers by, there are many different types of mental health problems. Some of the most common ones include anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia. So let's deep dive into that question. What is anxiety? Anxiety is a feeling of worry or fear that can be mild or severe. It can be caused by different things such as stress at work or school, a traumatic event, or a health problem. Now let's ask, what percentage of people have anxiety? Maya says it is estimated that about 18% of people in the United States have an anxiety disorder. But what about Canada? It says that there is no definitive answer to this question, as anxiety disorders can vary from country to country. However, it is estimated that around 1 in every 8 people in Canada will experience an anxiety disorder at some point in their life. Now let's try a statement instead of a question. Let's say that I am feeling anxious and see how Maya responds. Maya says, it is normal to feel anxious from time to time. However, if you're feeling anxious more often than not, it is impacting your daily life. You may have an anxiety disorder. Our next feature is the summarizer. The summarizer allows us to upload or paste text from a document and receive an intelligent summarization of the document. It is intended for the user to better understand key points of a document and to create flashcards on topics for later review. To receive a summarization of a topic, you can either paste text here, or you can upload a full document with this Upload from File button. To show you an example, I will upload this white paper on depression and anxiety in teens and young adults. As you can see, it is a 14-page paper, and it discusses effects and remedies for depression and anxiety in teens. Now let's see how Maya does in summarizing this paper. To get a summarization of the paper, I upload the PDF file. It parses the text here. Now, if I press summarize, and here is the summarization. It captures the gist of the paper, and it does capture its true essence. I can now save the summary. To do so, I type in a summary name and press save. Summary saved successfully. To view saved summaries, I press this button here, and it takes me to the summarization organizer. Here I can review the summaries like so. I can also mark for review, which will let me review it later. The time of review can be set in the profile settings. Here there is a review time option, and you can choose a day of the week to review and a time in that day. You will be notified by Maya at the date and time that you choose for review to review the summarizations. Next, let's move on to the assignment planner. With the assignment planner, you can create and schedule new tasks manually through this button, and you can also get an action plan from Maya through the new assignment button. Let's take a look. First, I want to create a new task. This is very simple. You can just add the task name, start time and duration, and create. And it will create the task on your calendar, like so. The more exciting feature is the new assignment. Let's take a look at this one. So here I can name an assignment title, and I can choose a start date, a due date, and number of hours needed. Next, I go to the type of assignment. It can be any. Research paper, lab report, there's different options here. I'm going to choose a research paper. And I'm going to ask Maya to propose an action plan. It proposes 3 plans for me. 1 evenly spaced tasks, 1 task each day, or 1 task every 2 days. I'll choose the first one. After I've reviewed the tasks, I can create the tasks, and the tasks will appear on my calendar. If you hover over the subtasks on your calendar, it will actually also give you a guideline on how to complete the task. For example, step 1, read your assignment outline. It gives the user an idea of how to do this task. Similarly, step 2, step 3, step 4. So the new assignment button helps break down projects or assignments into smaller subtasks, and it provides you with a guideline on how to complete the subtask. Maya also notifies you when a task is due. You also have the option to sync the task and subtask to your Google Calendar through the Connect to Google Calendar button. You can also view your tasks in a list form, and it will show you what is due today, what is upcoming, what is overdue, and what has been completed. Thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed
So that's just a little description here of one type of technology that can assist all students, including students with disabilities, in an inclusive way. And as I said, that's still under development. Finally, I want to talk about some of the questions arising from the war in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine, while seemingly still in its early stages, has already shown signs of disrupting inclusive education for the most vulnerable, both locally in Ukraine and internationally. So locally, the Russian invasion of Crimea in 2014 had the effect of disrupting progress made from a Canadian-funded inclusive education project in that region, severing relationships. And I was involved in that project at the time. More recently, international partnership efforts aimed at inclusive education research and practice have been interrupted by the war. So following the Ukrainian victory in Kiev, consideration is being given to re-engagement between an international research team, which I'm involved in, and our Ukrainian colleagues. But more broadly, the war in Ukraine may have had a long-term international impact. Inflation, resource and supply chain issues resulting from the conflict have been exacerbated and are challenging the global economic environment. And it is often the most vulnerable who suffer in these circumstances. Wheat, for example, 30% of our wheat is sourced from, I understand, Ukraine and Russia. So there is a problem for world food even, shortages. So questions directly pertaining to education arising from the conflict include, but are not limited to, the following. And I don't have answers to these questions. I'm just raising them here. What is the status of children with disabilities in regions of Ukraine directly impacted by the war? So are those children receiving an education? Are they safe? Are they being looked after? We really don't know that. How are Ukrainian refugee children coping? Is the education that they're receiving, amongst other supports, adequate? So there's been, as you know, a massive influx of Ukrainian children into countries like Poland, and I can imagine that their education systems are being strained by the extra children in their classes. And how are the global economic consequences of the war impacting the education of vulnerable children? As I said, I don't have an answer to those questions, but I do raise them because I think they're really important. And I think that's a potential future area of research here. So in conclusion, this presentation explored three areas with respect to the COVID-19 pandemic, and I highlighted the ways in which they relate to inclusive education for children with disabilities. So these included the challenges that children with disabilities have experienced in receiving an equitable and inclusive education during the COVID-19 pandemic, the impact of inclusive education on the pronounced empathy deficit relating to COVID-19, and issues for inclusive education brought about by the fourth industrial revolution that's advanced, perhaps coincidentally, throughout the period of the COVID-19 pandemic, with specific emphasis on artificial intelligence. And I've concluded here with some questions and ruminations about local and global impacts of the current and evolving war in Ukraine, including its immediate impact on Ukrainian children, economic conditions, and inclusive education research. So thank you very much for having me, for inviting me to present this morning or early this afternoon at your time. It's been a real pleasure, and I look forward to the next presentation. So thank you.